Distances don't begin with conflict. They begin with a quiet noticing. You find yourself less eager to call, slower to reply, more tired after conversations that once felt neutral. Nothing dramatic has happened, yet something inside has shifted. For many people, especially those who are reflective and inward-oriented, family closeness fades not because of anger, but because of accumulation. Small misunderstandings, repeated assumptions, and roles that no longer fit begin to press against the nervous system. This distance is often misread as coldness or ingratitude, but internally, it feels more like conservation, a subtle pulling back to breathe, to think, to exist without explanation. What looks like detachment from the outside may actually be a form of self-regulation, a way of preserving clarity when closeness starts to demand fragmentation. To understand why some people stop feeling close to their families, we have to look past behavior and into the quieter territory of inner safety, emotional load, and the cost of staying understood versus staying whole. A quiet adaptation, not a rebellion. What often looks like withdrawal is rarely a dramatic decision. It is usually a gradual adjustment the body makes when closeness starts to feel expensive. You notice yourself listening more carefully for exits than for meaning, choosing silence not to punish, but to stabilize. In families, emotional roles form early and tend to stay fixed. When your inner landscape changes but the role remains the same, the mismatch creates strain. The nervous system responds before the mind has language for it, pulling back slightly each time connection requires compression. Resentment, it is fueled by repetition. The same conversations, the same assumptions about who you are, quietly teach the body that proximity comes with a cost. So it adapts by narrowing exposure, by conserving energy, by staying just far enough to remain intact. Here is the subtle inversion. Distance can be a sign of care. Not care for harmony or appearances, but care for internal coherence. Some people don't move away from family because they don't love them. They move away because staying emotionally close would require leaving themselves behind. Begin to feel too small. Family closeness often depends on roles that were formed before you had a say in them. The responsible one, the quiet one, the one who doesn't cause trouble. These identities once offered belonging, but over time they can begin to feel like containers you have outgrown. Tension doesn't come from rejecting family, but from noticing how little room there is to move. When growth happens internally and the external script stays the same, every interaction carries a subtle friction. You are present yet partially folded, heard but only in the range that feels familiar to others. This is where distance quietly appears, not as defiance but as relief. Space becomes the only place where you don't have to edit your reactions or shrink your curiosity. The body relaxes because it no longer has to perform continuity with an outdated version of itself. The quiet grief here is rarely named. It's the sadness of realizing that closeness sometimes requires staying recognizable, while integrity requires becoming unknown. For some people, stepping back is not about breaking roles. It's about finally stepping outside them. The slow fatigue of being misunderstood at home. Misunderstanding inside a family rarely arrives as a single rupture. It accumulates quietly through moments that are small enough to dismiss, but frequent enough to exhaust. You explain something once, then again, then eventually you stop trying. Not because it isn't important, but because the cost of clarity becomes too high. What drains people is not disagreement, but misrecognition. Being seen through an outdated lens, having your tone reinterpreted, your silence misread, your changes treated as phases rather than signals. Over time, the body learns that home requires translation, and translation requires effort. This is where emotional fatigue sets in. You begin to ration your presence, offering shorter visits, lighter versions of yourself, safer topics. Not as avoidance, but as preservation. Distance becomes the only way to rest from the constant need to self-correct. The quiet truth is this: closeness without understand would our family. It feel lonelier not because they feel nothing, but because feeling everything while remaining unseen becomes unsustainable. How unspoken expectations replace genuinely. At least in many families, closeness is quietly governed by expectations that are never spoken aloud. You are loved, but conditionally aligned. Accepted, as long as you remain predictable. Over time, connection becomes less about meeting each other and more about maintaining an unspoken agreement. These expectations are subtle. They live in pauses, in tones, in what goes unquestioned. You feel them when deviation creates tension, when curiosity is met with concern, when change is treated as disruption rather than evolution. The body senses this long before the mind names it. As expectations accumulate, authenticity begins to feel risky. You share less not because you have nothing to say, but because honesty now carries consequences. Emotional distance forms as a buffer, a way to stay connected without being slowly reshaped into something more acceptable. The loss here is quiet but profound. When expectations replace curiosity, connection becomes performative. Some people step back not to reject family, but to protect the remaining places where they are still allowed to be real. Safety versus closeness. When the nervous system chooses space, there comes a point when closeness stops feeling soothing and starts feeling alerting. Not emotionally unsafe in an obvious way, but physiologically loud. Your body tightens before conversations. Your breath shortens in familiar rooms. Your attention scans for signals rather than settling into presence. This is not a conscious rejection of family. It is a quiet recalibration driven by the nervous system. When connection repeatedly coincides with tension, the body learns to associate distance with relief. Space becomes the only environment where regulation returns naturally. Is that this withdrawal is not about preference, but about capacity. The system is not choosing independence over love. It is choosing stability over overwhelm. Closeness that requires constant vigilance ceases to feel like closeness at all. So distance emerges not as an emotional statement, but as a biological one. A subtle decision to prioritize internal safety when relational proximity no longer offers it. Outgrowing love is a particular kind of distance that forms when love remains, but the structure around it no longer fits. You still care, you still notice birthdays, remember habits, feel concern instinctively, yet the old dynamics feel restrictive, like a language you once spoke fluently but now have to translate back into. This is where many people feel confused about themselves. They assume that pulling away must mean emotional failure or a lack of loyalty. But what's often happening is differentiation. The self has grown more complex, while the relational patterns have stayed flat. Remaining inside them would require simplification. So space becomes a way to love without erasure, not absence, but reconfiguration. You relate with more intention, fewer reflexes. You step back not to sever connection, but to prevent resentment from quietly taking its place. The tenderness here is easy to miss. Outgrowing dynamics does not mean outgrowing attachment. It means choosing a form of closeness that allows love to exist without self-betrayal. The seeking belonging to preserving integrity. At a certain point, the need to belong quietly gives way to the need to remain intact. This shift is rarely dramatic. It happens internally, almost without language, when you realize that being included no longer feels the same as being aligned. Earlier in life, belonging often meant adapting, softening edges, adjusting tone, overlooking friction. But over time, this constant accommodation begins to register as a loss, not of connection, but of coherence. You start to sense that something essential is being traded away for harmony. Preserving integrity doesn't mean choosing isolation. It means choosing relationships that don't require fragmentation. When family closeness repeatedly asks you to divide yourself, distance becomes the only way to stay whole. This is the quiet conclusion many arrive at without ever announcing it. The movement away is not driven by rejection, but by an internal realignment. A decision, felt more than thought, to stop chasing belonging and start honoring what remains true inside. A sign of damage. Some of it is a sign of discernment. When people stop feeling close to their families, it is often because they have begun to listen more carefully to what their inner world requires. This kind of separation is quiet. It doesn't announce itself through conflict or finality. It lives in pauses, in fewer explanations, in a gentler refusal to keep contorting for the sake of familiarity. What changes is not love, but the conditions under which love can exist without cost. For those who experience this shift, there is often grief mixed with relief. Grief for what closeness once promised, and relief at no longer having to negotiate their own shape. Distance becomes a way to remain honest, even if it is misunderstood. In the end, stepping back from family closeness is rarely about leaving others behind. It is about staying present with oneself. And sometimes, that is the only place where connection can begin again, in a form that no longer asks you to disappear in order to belong.